Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started since we only have an hour. I'd like to welcome you to this year's edition of the Alan Toff Lecture. Welcome to the University Lecture Series students who are here and to the guests who have come especially for this lecture. It is the first time we've been able to have the Alan Toff Lecture in person since 2019. So it's great that people are able to come in person again. We are recording the lecture and it will be available on our website. You can also contact events.scs@utoronto.ca. If you want to write that URL down, you can see me after the lecture. Let me begin now, as we usually do at U of T, with a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. This year marks the first time that we are holding the Alan Toff Lecture without Alan being here. Very sadly, earlier this year, Alan passed away in great old age and very peacefully. It was a sad moment for the school because he, although he had been retired, when he was teaching, he taught for 30 years at the school and had a vast range of courses in visual art and a huge number of students who would take every course that he offered. And an anonymous donor several years ago came forward to set up this lecture series in honor of Alan Toff. And it's all the more meaningful now that Alan has himself passed away. So the arts lecture, this Alan Toff Arts Lecture, is part of the University Lecture Series and part of the offerings in arts and humanities at the School of Continuing Studies. It features, over the years, artists, collectors, gallery owners, and other experts in all aspects of visual art, past and present. Past lecturers have included Charles Pachter, the visual artist, the architect Donald Schmidt, visual and performance artist Ken Monkman, curator Sarah Milroy, artist and poet Elder Duke Redbird, and art historian David Silcox. This year, we're very happy to have with us Emma Nishimura. She will be speaking today about her work as a current visual artist, and for the last decade, her research and work have focused on the experiences that her family and other Japanese Canadians endured during their forced incarceration during World War II. Her work explores this history and the reverberations these experiences have had throughout the subsequent generations. Emma has exhibited nationally and internationally. Her work is in a number of public and private collections, including the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Royal Ontario Museum, the Japanese Canadian National Museum, and the US Library of Congress. She's the recipient of the Queen Sonia Print Award in 2018. She received her MFA, Master in Fine Art, from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and her BA from the University of Guelph. She's an assistant professor and chair of photography, printmaking, and publications at our other sister university in Toronto, OCAD. So please join me in welcoming Emma. I'm sure we're all looking forward to what she has to show us and what she has to say. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Gordon. It's an honor to give this year's annual Toff Lecture. Before I begin, I'd like to extend a thank you to everyone that made this visit possible. And I want to extend my sympathies to Alan Toff's family, friends, and the many students that he worked with. Today, I'm going to introduce everyone to my work that I've been working through over the last 15 years. Do you want to move this? Yeah, sorry. Pause. I'll talk about some of the major themes that I've been exploring, and I'll get into some projects in depth. But first, I want to talk a little bit about some context and how this work got started, and kind of feels like it's important to lay the groundwork. And so everyone here is looking at this lovely box. So 15 years ago, I got a grant from the Ontario Arts Council to create a body of work of what it was to be mixed race. This had been my proposal. I'm half Japanese Canadian, half Scottish Canadian, very Canadian on many years. And so I went to my mom's house and I went into her basement and I remembered these old family albums. And so I went searching. I couldn't find the albums, but I came across this box. And so this box just said drafting patterns. When I opened up the box, there were over 200 of these garments. So they're all about kind of 4 to 6 inches tall, made of brown craft paper, kind of immaculately sewn together. In addition to these dresses, there were 5 books of patterns. This is from the first book. And so this is dated July 21st, 1941. So my grandmother took a drafting course when she was 18. And at this point, she was 18, living in Vancouver. She was born in Vancouver and then raised in Japan for a number of years and then had come back to Canada. There weren't a lot of opportunities for employment for Japanese Canadian women, and so many enrolled in these different drafting courses. Oh, sorry. For every pattern, for every mock-up of the pattern, there is the drawn garment. And they're these kind of wonderful 1940s clothes. And so then inside one of these books of patterns, I found a sheaf of notebook paper. And this is dated February 1st, 1943. And so at this point, my grandmother is living in Slocan City, interned as a Japanese Canadian, and she was making clothes for other internees. These pages are full of Japanese names and measurements. And so I found this box, and I found it represented so much more than just a course that my grandmother took. It was about her experience making clothes for others when they were interned. So growing up, I knew she could sew. I also spent a weekend with her. I also took sewing classes when I was growing up, and did spend a weekend with her sewing. But I didn't know many details. She would share stories, but not easily, I would say. I remember sitting around the dining room table, and my mom would ask questions about their time in the camps. And she would share little bits and pieces, but not a lot. I would say more noticeable were the silences and kind of knowing what wasn't being shared. So before I get into my work, I want to give a little bit more insight into the context as well. So December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. In response to that attack, Japanese Canadians were categorized as enemy aliens under the War Measures Act, which slowly began to remove their personal rights. Over the next 2 months, 1,200 Japanese Canadian-owned boats were impounded as a defense measure. My great-grandfather's fishing boat was seized during this time. In February 24th, 1942, the Canadian government issued an executive order authorizing the removal of all persons of Japanese racial origin within a 100-mile radius of the coast. So during this period, all Japanese Canadians' possessions were destroyed or sold by the government, and the proceeds from these sales helped to fund the internment. April 1942, approximately 22,000 Japanese Canadians were sent to internment camps in British Columbia, sugar beet farms in Manitoba and Alberta, self-supporting camps, road camps, or prisoner of war camps. In this photo, my grandmother is on the right with a group of women and some men in what I'm thinking is Slocan City, where she was sent, and that this photo would have been taken earlier before they built more permanent structures. You can see some tents in the background. The photo on the left is from my grandfather's photo album. I'm not sure if this is my grandfather, but my grandfather was sent to work and built part of the Trans-Canada Highway. In 1945, when the war ended, Japanese Canadians were given two options. They could move east or go to Japan. The majority of those who were interned had been born in Canada, and in essence, many the language is challenging, but I would say deported to Japan versus encouraged to return, which is kind of problematic. So I found this box of garments, and I knew this history, but I didn't spend a lot of time talking about it with my grandparents. My grandfather had died when I was young. My grandmother died about 5 years before I found this box. And so I sat with this box and struggled with how to talk about their experiences, how to talk about this point in Canadian history, and what to make. So I started by learning how to read her sewing patterns. So these were my own paper mock-ups. I wanted to echo her use of paper and also her use of working small. So I used Japanese paper, and this kind of really began my journey of retracing her actions. And this was one of the first pieces I made. I worked on this series for about 2 years. And this first series really, I thought about ideas of assimilation and what happened kind of after the war. So this need to move east, really it was about kind of twofold. The Canadian government wanted Japanese Canadians to disperse and spread out, to assimilate, to not have kind of the Japantown that had evolved over time in Vancouver. And the Japanese Canadians, it was about kind of disappearing into Canadian society and making sure that the internment never happened again. My father and my aunt, none of kind of my grandparents' children spoke Japanese. It was a conscious decision to switch to English and to kind of quote unquote be fully Canadian. And so this series really looked at these ideas of assimilating, of blending in, and of, in essence, kind of disappearing. These are all small pieces, kind of about 14 inches by 14 inches. I was using my own, I do a lot of printmaking. These are photo etchings that then I would print many times and then cut out the patterns so that everything could be kind of seamless. These were kind of the last two pieces in this series. So this piece is called Echoes from the Space Between, and in this I was interested in kind of where my grandmother's actions ended and where mine began, and this space between kind of her memories and her experiences and my own kind of retelling of this. So kind of harnessing all that printmaking has to offer, I kind of the brown or reddish printed garments. It's actually a soft ground etching, so I was able to run one of her dresses through the press and capture the impression of that, and then etch that plate, and then print that numerous times. And then there's a constructed garment that exists kind of in between, and so I created that out of kind of all of the paper surrounding these garments, so it's the right kind of tonality. So there was, this is the front, and then here's the back. And so during this time, I had gone to grad school and moved to Nebraska. And I brought this box of patterns. And it was interesting, kind of faculty were saying, you know, you've done this work, it's time to move on, what's the next piece? How do you want to explore this history next, or are you done? And I said, no, I'm not done. I'm not done with this history. I feel like I've only started. And so I made a full-size garment. And so this dress really, I scaled up to kind of fit me, but I wanted to keep using and echoing that use of paper that my grandmother had. So this is made out of Japanese paper. And And I made this first one, and I didn't like it. I sewed it on the sewing machine, and it looked stiff and awkward. And I got frustrated, and I crumpled it up. And then all of a sudden, I unfurled it, and it had this whole different body and this whole different presence. The paper, remembers those folds. And Japanese paper in particular, it looks really fragile and delicate, but it's very strong. And so I made this garment and was thinking about this box that I'd moved around Toronto and moved to Nebraska, and kind of what it had come to represent, and the weight that it kind of embodied. And so I was thinking about baggage and how we carry around these stories. And I created my own furoshiki. So a furoshiki, kind of traditional Japanese wrapping technique, you take a square of cloth or of paper and you can wrap up anything. You can wrap up a gift, you can wrap up your lunch. So I took a square of Japanese paper and put this dress in it and tied it up. And then for about 6 weeks, I enacted a personal performance. I would make a garment, take me kind of a week to make a garment. I would crumple it up and put it in this bundle and carry it around with me everywhere I went. And it was about, for me, it was kind of making real what it felt like to carry this box around with me, to move around the country and to move to the States with it. It had no weight, but it started taking up a lot of space. And so each week I would make a new garment. Kind of really thinking about sewing as this kind of gestures of memorialization, knowing that I couldn't ever recreate those clothes that my grandmother made. And I didn't need to, but it was kind of creating that echo. They're all about my size-ish, all made of paper, all the buttons work. I had a lot of fun. I was also really thinking of kind of the futility of my actions. I'm making these garments that I can't wear, that no one can wear, and that I can't, I can't go back in time. So it was always this kind of balance of connecting. It resulted in a show that I had in Nebraska, and so along with this, and while I was making all of these garments, I was recording histories and trying to piece together my grandmother's story. So I recorded a conversation I had with my aunt, who was living in Hawaii at the time, a conversation I had with my mom, who was back in Toronto, and then a conversation between my sister and I, all trying to piece together what my grandmother's kind of journey had been. And I was quite intrigued because my mom's story and my aunt's, so it would be kind of the daughter-in-law and the daughter, had lots of similarities, but then lots of differences too. Kind of the mess of storytelling and what gets lost over the years. And so when you went into this space, there were 4 different tracks of audio that you could stand under and hear my mom's version or my aunt's version, or a very short conversation between my sister and I. And really, we didn't remember a lot. It was kind of a space really of memory and of remembering. And you could walk up to these garments and they kind of float towards you and then they float away. And so while I was working on that series, I took a trip out west with my mom and my sister to visit, kind of really wanting to visit those sites of where the camps were and to try and kind of position myself in that landscape. And it's beautiful. And we struggled with that too, because it's this beautiful scenic tourist destination now. And lots of people get to live there as well by choice. But it wasn't a choice for my grandparents to be there. So it was kind of trying to reconcile the beauty with the reality and that history. And I'd been doing a lot of reading and researching, and I found real resonance with an academic named Marianne Hirsch. So she developed a theory called post-memory. The theory explores the idea that, quote, memories are traumatic events that live on to mark the lives of those who were not there to experience them. Children of survivors and their contemporaries inherit catastrophic histories, not through direct recollection, but through having post-memories, mediated images, objects, stories, behaviors, and effects passed down within the family and the culture at large. So Hirsch's research has focused primarily on the visual and literary legacies of the Holocaust. I found a lot of parallels between Japanese-Canadian history. And so that kind of still, I always come back to these ideas as I'm navigating my work. And so being out there, being at West, I was, kind of being in the land physically. I was doing all of this different research, reading academic texts, historical accounts, doing my own oral histories of different people. And I wanted to find a way to make some of this research a real part of my work. And so I was also just, myself trying to understand where the camps were located and kind of doing this mapping piece. And so I created my own map. And so this is a map of the interior of BC. On first glance, it's kind of this odd arrangement of frames on a gallery wall. But when you get up close, you find different locations. This piece is called Revelstoke. And I'm just going to jump ahead and then I'll come back to it. So if you get really close to these pieces, it's all text. And so it was incorporating all of this research, actually very literally and figuratively into the work. So coming back, this is Revelstoke, kind of where this river lake system connects with that darker road. That's Revelstoke. And so the text in this piece is men's firsthand accounts of what it was like to work on the road camps. And this is the section of road. There's kind of a dark line that travels kind of on a diagonal across this. My grandfather worked this section of the Trans-Canada to build it. Thinking about mark making on a conceptual level, kind of the difference between drawing a line versus writing a letter, writing a word, transcribing a whole paragraph or a whole essay. It's this different way of committing thought to an etched plate, which I was really intrigued with, that then becomes permanent. This piece is called Slocan Lake. This was really where the majority of the camps were located. So my grandmother was in Slocan City, which is right at the base of that lake. The text for this piece comes from two different sources. One is from Joy Kagawa's Obasan. And so I had read that novel as kind of in high school. And then, and when I was reading it in high school, I discovered that my grandmother had been interned in the same camp as Joy Kagawa. And so I remember having some conversations with her about it. I have no idea. I just wish I could go back and record that conversation. And then I reread the book as an adult. And what I was really intrigued with was what I had thought was my grandmother's experience was really the main character in the novel's experience. So this amazing way that we conflate stories and realities. And so there's a significant amount of text from Obasan in this book, in this print. And then the other text that I used is from Kirsten McAllister, who is a researcher and scholar who's looking at, there's a memorial that's been built in New Denver, which is kind of in the middle of Slocan Lake. And so she's looking at, the Japanese Canadian community who are there, and then how this memorial is impacting everyone else in the community as well. So wanting to kind of look back as well as think about what's happening right now. So in thinking about this mapping series that considers the landscape and geography of internment, I turned to Japanese Canadian scholar Mona Okawa, who writes about how the violence of internment, quote, has been and continues to be suppressed. She notes that the long-term effects of this violence enacted against Japanese Canadians this is the beginning of the quote, are difficult to see and hence to name, unless we actually visualize and render visible the material spaces to which people were forced to move and the people who were moved into those spaces. When I show this work, I have, there's some magnifying glass. You can actually see a plinth just to the right. And it's about really getting people to engage with the work in a physical way too, asking people to get up close and spend time. Some people can make out the text, some can't. It's pretty small. I discovered a weird skill for writing very small. But thinking about kind of, what's accessible and what's not. And so much of this history really, when I went through high school, it was half a page in our history textbook. Things are changing and there's more conversation now. But wanting to talk about the challenges of how accessible this history is and who wants to share those stories. There's a lot of people who don't want to share the stories. So it's challenging navigating the space. So I like to work on different projects at the same time and keeps things interesting for me. And so I kept finding myself being pulled back to the family albums, which I did eventually find. And so there's a couple different albums. Here we go. So this is my grandmother's album. It tells her story from life in Vancouver to Japan and back to Canada again. This is my grandmother and her mother. And so this is actually the summer that she's taking that drafting course. So great outfits here. So she's 18 in this picture. And then the album goes on to document her life in the camps, her friends, where they lived, and kind of the playful nature that these are all displayed in. They're just pretty interesting albums in their own right. This is some photos of my grandfather's albums that also present his early years, his life is born in Vancouver, then raised in Japan, and then he came back just before the war. And so here, pictures of him working the road camp. And it was interesting talking to my aunt about these. She said that when she was growing up, my grandparents would share these albums with them, but that he only ever said, "This is where I worked." He didn't ever say why he was there. There was no context given. And so I'm navigating all of these photos, and it's this question of what do I make? How does my own work come out of this? How do I explore the weight of this history and share that with others? And so I went back to think about the garments that I'd made, thinking about this box that I carried around with me, and the furoshiki that I had made, thinking about kind of that weight of memory. So I started to do some research into the furoshiki, traditional Japanese wrapping process. Really, it's a single piece of cloth. It has a history more than 1,200 years old. Historical uses ranged from keeping valuables of the emperors safe in the 6th century to wrapping and carrying clothes for nobility in the 10th centuries, to kind of fast forward to today, where it's a key part of this tradition of wrapping, of giving gifts, and really it's considered impolite to give a gift that isn't wrapped. So thinking about this, and all of these photos that I had kind of inherited. This is a photo of my grandmother and her 2 sisters, her mom and her grandparents. This is when they were in Japan. I turned this photograph into a photogravure etching, and then I turned it into a sculpture. And so this is my own furoshiki. And really I was thinking about how do we kind of pack away these memories and stories? How do we pass them on to future generations? How do we sort and contain all of these things and all of these intangible stories? So family stories get kind of folded depending on how this object is folded. Different elements of the photograph are hidden, others are revealed. So this is another image of my grandmother and her 2 sisters and their mom. And then on the right here you can see kind of different ways of wrapping, and different parts of that photograph get hidden. They're pretty small. They fit in the palm of my hand. They weigh nothing, but they look heavy, and I really loved that idea. So what I do is it's a sculptural paper making technique. So I've worked with paper makers in Toronto at a studio called Paper House, and we hand make the paper. When you're kind of regularly, not sculpturally, but regularly making a piece of paper, the pulp is beaten for kind of 45 minutes-ish. This pulp has been beaten for 5 to 6 hours, so the fibers of the pulp get really, really short. And then I've made a mold out of sand and saran wrap and nylon stocking, so kind of a little bundle of sand. And then we make the paper, but don't allow it to dry. So it stays wet, and I bring it home, and then I have a press at home and in my studio, and then I put this bundle of sand kind of all ready. I ink up these photo etching plates that I've made, kind of turned this album into photo etchings, wrap it around this bundle of sand, and then everything dries, and as everything's drying, it's shrinking because those fibers are so short. So it shrinks and it dries really hard. You can cut a hole. I cut a hole in the bottom of it once it's all dry, and I drain out the sand and all of the wrappings for the bundle, for the mold. And then I patch up the bottom. You can kind of see a little triangle in the bottom. So I cut into it, drain out everything, patch it up. So these are really weightless. I've made probably about 400 to date. Again, I like doing small things, and I like repetitive things. These are good things if you're interested in being a printmaker. This is my grandfather. I think this was his passport photo coming back to Canada. This is the truck he drove when he was working on the road cruise. And this photo is kind of, there's also, there's the reality and the big picture of what happened, but there's all these wonderful small stories of joy and of kind of what daily life looked like. All these different road crews were spread out along the Trans-Canada Highway, and then different crews formed their own baseball teams. They got custom sweaters made they ordered them from Eaton's catalogs, and so this was the baseball team that was the crew really from Yard Creek, and then they would play in farmers' fields. This is a photo of my grandparents and my dad. So my dad was born in '46, right after the war, and they moved east kind of shortly after this. So again, I made lots of these. And some of them remain unprinted, wanting these to be stand-ins for all those stories that we don't know. Some of them have been forgotten over time. Others, people haven't wanted to share. So they've been installed in kind of different arrangements. And this piece is called An Archive of Rememory. And so displayed on this series of shelves, what I find interesting is when people come and see the work, they want to get up close, they want to pick them up. And I encourage them not to. But there is that desire there. And this is an ongoing series. Initially started off exploring, using photographs from my own family albums. But the desire for this is to really invite other Japanese Canadians to then allow me to use those images, so that I can create a much larger archive that can be more reflective of kind of the wider Japanese Canadian experience. And so I'm making all these furoshiki, this form and this idea of containing memory really is very much at the forefront. And I had been doing different interviews for the map piece. I was interviewing different people. I was meeting through the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, kind of wanting to find different people who had been interned in different camps and wanting those stories to be a part of those map areas. And so then I was meeting these wonderful people and said, would you be willing to share your story, your experience? And so I started making this series of prints. So these are all etchings. It's from a series called Collected Stories. And I really think of these as portraits, really. When you get up close, it's all text. So I really sit down with folks and record an audio version of their experience and kind of whatever people want to share. And then I transcribe that conversation. And then I sit for several months and transcribe that story many, many times over into these prints. So text is kind of layered over and over to create shadows. And kind of again, it's coming back to those ideas that I was starting to explore in the map series of using text, is kind of what happens for me from a process perspective when I'm spending so many months writing out these stories, listening to these. I feel like I get to know people really well. And I was kind of talking to different people so this piece is Harold Miwa. So Harold was born in 1930, and he was 13 when he went to camp. And he was sent to Tajmi. And so it was interesting to hear his story of being a young boy in camp and what that experience was like. This piece is Frank Maritsugu. He was born in 1922. And he was actually in the same camp, same road camp as my grandfather. And just really interesting kind of hearing what those different journeys were and where life took them after the war as well. And then lots of open spaces, particularly this piece, kind of acknowledging, again, all those stories that we don't know. This piece here, this is Terry Itanoe. And so a lovely story about this was I was at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Centre interviewing some folks for the MAP project, and this older man sat down across from me. There was a kind of a free lunch that I got to go to, and I was chatting with this gentleman and said, what was your story during the war? Where were you sent? He said, well, I was at Yard Creek. I said, oh, well, my grandfather was there, and we did the name game exchange. And he said, well, I was best man at his wedding. I said, what? Are we talking about the right person? So we kind of went through it, and yes, indeed, it was my grandfather. And my grandfather died when I was 12. So we arranged to meet a couple weeks later, and I brought all those photo albums to the center, and we spent 4 hours and we looked through these albums, and first off, I showed them the wedding photos and said, is this you? I said, well, no, it wasn't me. He's like, well, where was I? And he's like, I don't know why I missed their wedding, but then there was plenty of photos of him throughout the albums. And then I got this amazing story of my grandfather's experiences. So this is Terry's piece. So lots of writing, lots of time to spend with Terry. And thinking about kind of the gift-giving side of the furoshiki. One of the lovely things about being a printmaker is that I make multiples. So always I'll do these interviews with people and then agree that I will give them a print when we're done, kind of as a real thank you for sharing their stories and for being willing to share. This piece is Kiyo Shibutani. He was 12 when he went to Tajmi, and he was actually friends with Harold, and it was interesting to interview two people at the same time, because then you get a different kind of a conversation, and they were asking each other questions that I didn't feel like I had permission to ask. So kind of wonderful things come to the surface. But as viewers, we don't get to hear those stories, and we don't get to access those stories. So again, thinking about kind of writing at this scale, and I would say with most of my work, it's always about kind of this balance of what's accessible and what's inaccessible, and really acknowledging this history and how much we can wrap our arms around it and how much we don't know. And so Kyo, he was born in Vancouver, but then his family decided to go to Japan after the war. And so his experience of arriving in Japan and of being seen as a foreigner, kind of looking the same but having the wrong accent and the wrong cultural upbringing, was such a challenge for him. And so it's just very intriguing to hear kind of what life looked like for different people after the internment. And he came back to Canada 10 years later. This piece is Lillian Michiko Blakey. And so Lillian was born at the end of the war in Coaldale in Alberta. And so her grandparents and parents had wanted to stay together. And so some families, kind of before everyone was sent away to the different internment camps, if you wanted to stay together, you were allowed to move to these self-supporting farms in Alberta and kind of work for farmers. So a family of 9 was housed in a chicken coop, and Lillian was born there in July of 45. Lillian is also an artist in her own right. And it was interesting to talk to her and hear kind of when her family started talking about the internment. And she said it wasn't until her 20s that she knew what had happened and why they had been in Alberta. And a lot of this is kind of when certain books started to come out. And I would say kind of mid-70s is when kind of the talk started to happen. And so close-up of Lillian's. And this series also is ongoing. Takes me several months to work on these, so it's a slow-going venture. I can also only write for so many hours in a day, so it's nice to have series that are ongoing. In 2019, I was able to do a residency in Sweden. So I had won this award from the Queen of Norway, and was then able to do this residency in Sweden. And so they said, what do you want to do? And I said, let's work big. Let's do some things that I don't necessarily have access to in Toronto. So first we did a series of 9 prints. And so this series here, it all uses photo documentation from my Archive of Rememory series from those sculptural furoshikis. But in these prints, it was, kind of continuing to explore those ideas of post-memory, of how these kind of subsequent generations relive and pass on these experiences of trauma. But in these pieces, it's no longer a sculpture. It's this flattened print. We can no longer pick up this sculpture. We can't turn it around. We can't kind of hold it and understand it. We can't undo that picture and see the whole thing. Really only one perspective has been left and recorded. And so I was thinking about these in terms of generations and thinking from a process perspective. I've started off with an original photograph that's turned into a photo etching, that's printed on a piece of paper, that turns into a sculpture, that's then digitally documented, that's then turned back into a photo etching, that's then printed onto paper. So there's really all of these generations of an image, and what happens along there, kind of what's been lost and what's been gained. And so we also worked quite large. And so this is Ula, who owns the print shop. And so we worked on these 2 large photo etchings. So this is a kind of recent installation shot of these prints, so it gives you a little sense of scale for those 2. And so this is kind of an image from one of them. And so this series, Generations of an Archive, I'm interested in kind of all of those things that I was just talking about, but also diving into kind of the details of family history, I would say. And so in this image, you see it's the same photograph that I've used for both of these furoshiki, but different perspectives. So, and also different ways of wrapping. So thinking of kind of the different storytellers over the years of there's kind of that one story or the many stories that people always return to and tell over and over and over again. But then there's different storytellers. So what gets lost, what gets prioritized, what's kept secret, and then how do those pieces kind of coexist, which, you know, kind of loops me back to the very beginning of really comparing these different narrations of my grandmother's experience from my mom's perspective and from my aunt's perspective. This piece here is, again, kind of using the same image, but then wrapped different times. And so my grandmother's experience, she was born in Vancouver, and then they went to Japan for a couple years. And then when my grandmother's mother said it's time for, and they were living with my grandmother's, the paternal side. Basically when my grandmother's grandparents said, okay, you're going back to Canada, well, you need to leave one of the kids here to help in the kitchen. So my grandmother's mother, unable to leave just one of the kids behind, she left the two eldest in Japan to live with the grandparents, and then she took the youngest back to Canada. And so for my grandmother, it was, you know, a lot of trauma on a lot of levels over the years of really feeling abandoned in Japan. And then she came back to Canada 10 years later. So in this piece, kind of having these kids separated, kind of lots of references to those stories. For my grandmother then, you know, when she came back to Canada, she was 16. She was put in a kindergarten class because there weren't any ESL classes. So we have photos of her in that class, and she looks like she's one of the teachers. And then 2 years later, she takes that drafting course, and then 2 years later, she's interned. So I would say, for me growing up, it was, you know, kind of knowing there was a lot of trauma in my grandparents, in both of their lives. My grandfather was much more quiet. But these, in particular, these were the stories that my grandmother always came back to. And so on that cheerful note, I'm gonna wrap up and wanting to create some space for questions. And yeah, so that's kind of about 15 years of work for me. So thank you for being here and for listening. And I'm gonna open it up to some questions. And if you kind of put up your hand, I can call on you, and then I'm just gonna repeat your question just to make sure that everyone hears it. So if there are any questions, I welcome that conversation.
I'll start us off. Did any of the people you interviewed about their story tell you that the process of recounting it to you changed their thinking about the past?
So the question is kind of, did anyone who I interview, kind of through that interview process, did that change their experiences and kind of how they were thinking about things, is how I'm interpreting your question. I would say there was just a really kind of thoughtful way of meeting. When I was talking to Terry, so he was the one who was good friends with my grandfather, his wife said, you know, I haven't seen him that engaged for that long. We sat for 4 hours. She's like, I haven't seen him kind of come to life in that way in a really long time. So that was very special. And then when I was interviewing Harold and Keo, it was watching them ask each other questions and them saying, I hadn't thought about it that way, and what about this? And just holding that space for conversation is so important. And I think that's what's been one of the most meaningful things about my work, is kind of creating these spaces where people can come together and talk about things. So that's, just as an artist, to be able to kind kind of create some of those conditions is such a pleasure, really, and an honor. Yeah. Yeah.
So, on the subject of conversation being difficult for a lot of these people, I understand that is common in all, like, residential school survivors, Holocaust survivors, that it's very common that they don't want to speak about it. And I'm wondering if, it's interesting when you get them together, they can speak about it. So it's almost like they have this collective consciousness together that they're able to. And I'm wondering if you, in all of the conversations that you've had with all these people, if you have any insight as to what it is that, is it like shame? Is it like, what's the difficulty? Why?
So the question is kind of looking at some commonalities across different groups of people of the challenges of talking about trauma, really. I think from the Japanese-Canadian perspective, there's so many different emotions. Shame was definitely a big one. There's also a saying that I will probably say wrong because I don't speak Japanese, shikita ga nai, which really meant it cannot be helped. So amongst Japanese culture, it was this, like, it happened, we have to move forward. We can't do anything about it, and on we go. And so I think I even have I don't know how to get back there. Maybe I can get back there? Oh, no, sorry, I don't have a close-up of it. Anyway, in one of these map pieces, just along the bottom, it really says Shikita Ganai over and over and over again. And really a common thread of, for them, it was like, we got to move past it, we can't dwell in it. But what I find really interesting right now is there's, so I'm Beyonce generation, I'm fourth generation, half, and there's a real movement right now amongst third and fourth generation of really wanting to talk about this history and engage in the history. There's also a real acknowledgement that those who were interned aren't going to be around that much longer. So we need to have these conversations. And, I don't want to speak for other survivors of trauma and put words in their mouth, but I would say kind of when you get together, there is this kind of a safe space. And I think I had this conversation recently with a group of Japanese Canadians. It was kind of navigating this conversation of safety, of people feeling okay to share their stories, and then me as an artist using their words in my work. So another reason why I write so small is that history is there for people to, it's there, and you can get part of it, but I'm not saying, here's the whole transcript, and off you go. So really kind of trying to negotiate that balance. Yeah.
We maybe have time for one more question.
Perfect. Yes?
Are Japanese people religious people? And if so, did this experience change the way they believe, so to speak?
So the question is, are Japanese Canadians kind of religious people? I think kind of a difficult question to answer kind of globally like that. I don't know. Religion didn't feature into the conversations that I had very much. I know my great uncle was president of the Buddhist Association, and therefore he was deemed a significant threat, so he was sent to a POW camp in Ontario. I think it was really different individuals kind of reacted differently, and that's kind of always going to happen. There's a lot of generalizations that happen, and I think it's just always needing to be careful with those generalizations. But it's a long history. I think we have to wrap up. Yeah, okay. Thank you so much.